By 1943, military armorers across every front were discovering something they could not officially acknowledge. Sidearms were coming back from the field, modified, not damaged, not worn, modified. Triggers that should have required 5 pounds of pressure now broke at 2. Barrels that left the factory smooth now had threads cut into the muzzle. Sights that were standardized across units had been filed, replaced, or painted. Grips that were issued in regulation shape had been carved, wrapped, or completely rebuilt. Military doctrine was explicit. Sidearms were secondary weapons issued for self-defense and close-quarters engagement. They were designed to function reliably under adverse conditions, and soldiers were absolutely forbidden from modifying them. The trigger mechanism was engineered for safety, not speed. The barrel was finished to specifications that prohibited attachment of unauthorized devices. The sights were standardized for training consistency. The grips were shaped for general use, not individual preference. But doctrine did not account for the officer who needed to draw and fire in the time it took an enemy to cover 3 meters, or the soldier whose standard sights were invisible in low light, or the man whose issued grips did not fit his hand during the chaos of close combat. So they modified their pistols anyway, in quiet moments behind the lines. With tools that were not supposed to exist and skills acquired before the war, they lightened triggers. They threaded barrels. They changed sights. They reshaped grips. They made alterations that improved their effectiveness and violated every regulation governing sidearm maintenance. When armorers discovered these modifications during inspections, the consequences varied. Sometimes the pistol was confiscated immediately. Sometimes the soldier faced disciplinary action. And sometimes, when the soldier's record made questions uncomfortable, officers simply chose not to look too closely. Because a modified pistol that had saved a soldier's life in close combat was difficult to condemn. And when the man carrying it had survived situations where others had not, questioning his methods required answering why he was still alive. Some of these modifications worked as intended. Some created problems their makers never anticipated. All of them existed in the space between what regulations authorized and what actually happened when men whose lives might depend on a sidearm decided that factory specifications were inadequate. These are the 5 banned pistol modifications soldiers hid anyway. Number 5. Lightened trigger mechanisms. The pull that could cost everything. The trigger pull on a military sidearm was designed for one thing: preventing accidental discharge. 5 to 6 pounds of pressure required, heavy enough that holstering, drawing, or rough handling would not cause an unintended shot. Heavy enough that a soldier under stress would not fire accidentally. But that heavy trigger pull was not designed for speed. It was designed for safety. For soldiers who might handle their pistols while running, climbing, or fighting hand-to-hand. Sidearms were last resort weapons, and their triggers reflected that priority. But some soldiers needed their sidearms to be more than last resort. Officers who led from the front, soldiers who cleared buildings, men who fought in close quarters where the enemy might be within arm's reach, and the difference between firing first and firing second was measured in fractions of a second. So they lightened their triggers, carefully filing the sear surfaces, replacing factory springs with lighter ones, reducing the pull from 5 pounds to 3, sometimes to 2. In documented cases to less than 1 pound. Military regulations explicitly forbade trigger modifications on sidearms. The reasoning was sound. A trigger that was too light could fire when the pistol was dropped. A sear that had been improperly filed could slip during holstering. An over-lightened spring could fail to reset properly, turning a semi-automatic pistol into a single-shot weapon in the middle of a firefight. Those fears were not theoretical. Reports described soldiers who modified their triggers and suffered accidental discharges. An American lieutenant whose 1911 fired while being holstered, the round striking his leg. A British officer whose Webley discharged during a fall, killing a soldier nearby. A German officer whose lightened P-38 fired unintentionally during hand-to-hand combat. But for every accident there were soldiers who swore their modified triggers saved lives, who claimed that a clean 2-pound break allowed them to fire accurately under stress where a heavy 5-pound pull would have caused them to miss, who believed that speed mattered more than the additional safety margin. Armorers who discovered lightened triggers treated them as serious violations. The pistol was immediately pulled from service. The trigger mechanism inspected and replaced with factory parts. The soldier faced consequences ranging from written reprimands to reduction in rank. But enforcement was complicated. An officer who had used his modified 1911 to survive multiple close-quarters engagements was difficult to discipline. A soldier whose lightened trigger had allowed him to defend his position successfully raised uncomfortable questions about why regulations prevented modifications that clearly worked. So some commanders looked the other way. Some soldiers became expert at hiding their modifications, maintaining spare factory parts to swap in before inspections. And some armorers, understanding the difference between garrison safety and combat necessity, simply chose not to inspect too carefully. The lightened trigger was never approved. It was never safe by garrison standards, and it remained one of the most common modifications soldiers made to their sidearms, hidden from authority, and used when speed mattered more than regulations. Number 4. Threaded barrels. The modification that raised questions. A threaded barrel on a military pistol meant one thing: someone intended to attach a suppressor. And suppressors were not issued to ordinary soldiers. They were restricted to special operations units, intelligence operatives, commandos conducting clandestine missions. For a regular soldier to possess a pistol with a threaded barrel raised questions that went beyond simple regulation violation. The modification itself was not complex for someone with machining skills: a lathe, proper threading dies, careful measurement. The barrel muzzle was cut with threads that would accept a suppressor or other muzzle device. The work required precision, but it was not beyond the capability of soldiers who had worked as machinists before the war. Military regulations were absolute. Barrel modifications were forbidden. Threading a barrel specifically to accept unauthorized attachments was treated as evidence of intent to operate outside official channels. A soldier discovered with a threaded barrel faced not just confiscation and discipline, but investigation into what he had been doing and who had authorized it. But some soldiers threaded their barrels anyway. Not all possessed suppressors. Some simply wanted the option. Others had acquired improvised suppressors through unofficial means. A few were preparing for missions they knew would require sound reduction, and were unwilling to rely on official channels that moved too slowly. American soldiers operating in urban environments occasionally threaded 1911 barrels. The goal was not always suppression. Some attached improvised flash hiders. Others wanted muzzle weights to reduce recoil. But the threading itself was the violation, regardless of what was attached. British officers in special operations sometimes had Webley or Browning high-power barrels threaded for classified missions. When these pistols appeared in regular units afterward, questions arose about how they had been acquired and what they had been used for. German officers occasionally had P-38 barrels threaded, particularly in the final years of the war, when operations behind enemy lines became more common. Soviet officers working with partisan units sometimes carried threaded Tokarev pistols, though documentation is limited. When armorers discovered a threaded barrel, the response was immediate and severe. The pistol was confiscated. The soldier was questioned extensively. Military intelligence sometimes became involved, particularly if the soldier could not provide a satisfactory explanation for why his sidearm had been modified in a way that suggested covert operations. The threaded barrel was different from other modifications. It did not improve accuracy. It did not enhance reliability. Its only purpose was to accept attachments that regular soldiers were not supposed to possess, which meant discovery raised questions that simple trigger jobs or sight modifications did not. Some soldiers who threaded their barrels had legitimate reasons they could not explain without revealing classified information. Others had operated in gray areas where official authorization was deliberately ambiguous. And some had simply taken initiative that doctrine did not allow, modifying their weapons for missions they anticipated rather than ones they had been assigned. The threaded barrel represented the most sensitive pistol modification, not because it was the most dangerous, but because it suggested activities that command either did not know about or did not want documented. Number 3. Modified sights. The aim that doctrine ignored. Factory sights on military pistols were designed for standardization: same height, same width, same profile across every weapon in a unit. Training assumed those sights. Maintenance procedures assumed those sights. And doctrine required that those sights remain unaltered. But factory sights were designed for average conditions and average users. They did not account for soldiers who needed to acquire targets in near darkness, or men whose eyesight made standard sight pictures difficult, or combat situations where a tall front sight slowed target acquisition by fractions of a second that mattered. So soldiers modified their sights. Some filed front posts lower, believing faster sight alignment was worth sacrificing precise elevation. Others painted sights with white or luminous compounds to make them visible in low light. A few replaced sights entirely with improvised alternatives fashioned from salvaged materials. Military regulations forbade sight modifications. The reasoning was practical. Changing sights altered point of impact. A pistol zeroed with factory sights would not hit the same point with modified sights. And soldiers who modified their sights might miss when accuracy mattered most. But soldiers who modified their sights did not rely on factory zero. They re-zeroed their pistols themselves, tested their modifications, and when they found improvements, they kept them hidden. American soldiers with 1911 pistols commonly filed front sights. The standard sight was tall and thick, designed to be highly visible. But in close-quarters combat, some soldiers found it slowed target acquisition. A filed-down front sight allowed faster shooting at close range where precise aiming was less important than speed. British soldiers occasionally painted their pistol sights white for visibility in dim conditions. German soldiers working in urban environments sometimes modified P-38 sights. Similarly, Soviet soldiers painted Tokarev sights with whatever materials were available. The most sophisticated modifications involved replacing sights entirely. Soldiers with metalworking skills fabricated custom sights from brass, steel, or salvaged materials. Some created sights with enlarged rear notches for faster alignment. Others built sights specifically for night use. When armorers discovered modified sights, the response varied based on the modification. Filed sights were often simply noted and ignored, particularly if the soldier's marksmanship record was good. Painted sights were sometimes cleaned off and the soldier warned. Replaced sights were treated more seriously, with the pistol confiscated for restoration. But enforcement was inconsistent. A soldier who had used his modified pistol successfully in combat was difficult to discipline for making his weapon more effective. An officer who had modified his sidearms sights for night operations raised questions about whether doctrine should have authorized such modifications in the first place. The modified sight was one of the most common and least punished pistol modifications. It was easy to do, difficult to detect if done subtly, and often improved effectiveness in the specific conditions where the soldier used his sidearm. If you've made it this far, you understand this is not about celebrating violations. It's about understanding choices made when standardization failed to account for individual needs and tactical realities. Stay with me. The final two modifications reveal how far soldiers were willing to go. Number 2. Custom grip work. The fit regulations did not allow. Factory grips on military pistols were designed to fit the average hand. They were shaped for mass production. They were finished to specifications that prioritized cost and consistency over individual fit, and they were never intended to be altered. But not every soldier had average-sized hands, and not every combat situation allowed for a perfect grip. Soldiers with large hands found factory grips too small. Those with small hands found them awkward. Men fighting in cold weather found smooth grips slippery with gloves. Those in hot climates found them slick with sweat. So some soldiers modified their grips. They carved checkering into smooth surfaces to improve purchase. They reshaped contours to better fit their hands. They wrapped grips with cord, tape, or cloth to build up areas that felt thin. They filed down sections that dug into palms during recoil. Military regulations forbade grip modifications. Grips were government property. Altering them was considered defacement, and modifications introduced variables that armorers could not account for. A wrapped grip might interfere with magazine seating. Carved checkering might weaken the grip panel. Reshaped contours might affect how the pistol balanced, but soldiers whose lives might depend on their sidearms prioritized fit over regulations. A pistol that fit the hand properly was more likely to be drawn quickly, aimed accurately, and controlled during rapid fire. An ill-fitting pistol was a liability in close combat. American soldiers commonly modified 1911 grips. The factory grips were smooth and relatively thin. Some soldiers carved aggressive checkering for better grip. Others wrapped them with paracord or tape. A few replaced factory grips with custom-made alternatives fashioned from available materials. German soldiers occasionally reshaped P-38 grips, which some found too large or awkwardly angled. British soldiers sometimes modified Webley grips, which were designed for different hand sizes than many users possessed. Soviet soldiers wrapped Tokarev grips to compensate for smooth factory finish. The most sophisticated grip modifications involved complete reshaping. Soldiers with woodworking skills removed material to better fit their hands, built up areas that needed more support, created grips that were personalized to their anatomy and shooting style. When armorers discovered grip modifications, responses varied. Minor checkering or wrapping was sometimes ignored. Extensive reshaping was treated more seriously, with the grips replaced and the soldier disciplined. But enforcement was complicated by the fact that grip modifications often improved performance measurably. Officers who modified their own pistol grips created additional complexity. Enlisted men disciplined for grip modifications could point to officers doing the same thing, and officers with modified grips who performed well in combat made it difficult to argue that such modifications were inherently wrong. The custom grip modification represented the conflict between standardization and individual fit. Doctrine assumed one grip design worked for everyone. Reality demonstrated otherwise. And soldiers who modified their grips chose personal effectiveness over regulatory compliance. Number 1. Extended magazines. The capacity they were not supposed to have. Military pistols were issued with standard capacity magazines. 7 rounds for the 1911, 8 for the P-38, 6 for the Webley, 8 for the Tokarev. These capacities were determined by design limitations and doctrinal considerations. Sidearms were defensive weapons. Situations requiring more than a single magazine were supposed to be exceptional. But combat did not follow doctrine. Urban fighting. Close quarters building clearing. Situations where reloading was not an option because the enemy was too close and moving too fast. Soldiers in these environments wanted more rounds in their pistols. More rounds meant more time before a vulnerable reload. More chances to stop threats without running dry. So some soldiers extended their magazines. They welded extensions to magazine bodies. They fabricated longer magazine tubes from available materials. They modified springs to accommodate additional rounds. The result was magazines that held more ammunition than regulations allowed. Military regulations explicitly forbade magazine modifications. The reasoning was sound. Extended magazines were more likely to malfunction. Feeding issues increased with capacity. Springs designed for 7 rounds might not reliably push 9 or 10, and extended magazines protruded from the grip, making the pistol more difficult to conceal and more likely to catch on equipment. Those concerns were valid. Improvised magazine extensions often failed. Welded bases separated under stress. Homemade magazine bodies split during use. Springs designed for fewer rounds failed to push cartridges reliably. Soldiers who used extended magazines sometimes found themselves with jammed pistols at critical moments. But for every failure, there were soldiers who believed the additional capacity was worth the risk, who valued having 10 rounds instead of 7, who had been in situations where those extra rounds made the difference. American soldiers in the Pacific Theater occasionally extended 1911 magazines. The close quarters fighting in jungles and caves made rapid magazine changes difficult. Extra rounds in a single magazine reduced vulnerability. German soldiers in urban combat sometimes extended P-38 magazines for similar reasons. The most common extensions were simple, welded base plates that added space for 2 or 3 additional rounds. More sophisticated modifications involved fabricating entirely new magazine bodies, though these required metalworking skills most soldiers did not possess. When armorers discovered extended magazines, the response was immediate. The magazine was confiscated and destroyed. Standard magazines issued as replacement, and the soldier faced disciplinary action for modifying government property in a way that compromised reliability. But some soldiers maintained both standard and extended magazines. Standard magazines for inspections, extended magazines for combat. The practice required hiding the extended magazines carefully, but soldiers in units with inconsistent oversight sometimes succeeded. The extended magazine represented the clearest violation of design intent. Unlike trigger jobs or sight modifications that altered how a pistol functioned, extended magazines changed what the pistol was. They transformed a defensive sidearm into something approaching a primary weapon, and that transformation suggested a level of combat intensity that doctrine assumed should be rare. Yet they existed, built in secret, hidden from authority, and used by soldiers who decided that having more ammunition immediately available was worth the risk of both punishment and potential malfunction. These were the 5 banned pistol modifications. Soldiers hid anyway, from lightened triggers that made sidearms faster and more dangerous, to threaded barrels that raised questions about covert operations, to modified sights that prioritized individual needs over standardization, to custom grips that acknowledged what doctrine would not, to extended magazines that gave soldiers capacity they were not supposed to have. Each modification violated regulations designed to maintain control, ensure safety, and standardize equipment. Each was hidden from inspectors, maintained in secret, and used when combat effectiveness mattered more than regulatory compliance. Some of these modifications improved performance. Others created dangers their makers did not fully anticipate. All existed in the gray space between what doctrine authorized and what actually happened when men whose lives might depend on a sidearm decided that factory specifications were inadequate for the reality they faced. The truth about World War II sidearms was never as clean as regulations suggested. Soldiers were issued pistols designed by committees, manufactured to standards, and expected to use them without alteration. Then they carried those pistols into close-quarters combat where individual needs, tactical requirements, and split-second timing made standardization insufficient. Some of those modifications were right. Some were wrong. All were human. The gap between doctrine and reality was never closed. It was simply crossed. One unauthorized modification at a time by men who decided that improving their chances of survival was worth the risk of punishment. If you want World War II history without simplification or mythology, subscribe. There's more coming.